Alrighty, welcome to this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA. No, I'm just having fun doing this again. Welcome. Um, my name is Edwin Sarmiento, and welcome to uh, the weekly episode. What I do is I cover topics that pertain to SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery, but I want to make it as practical as I possibly can because, for one, high availability and disaster recovery solutions are already complex, they're expensive, they're complicated, and I want to simplify, although the term is not really simplification, but really make it practical where you can take actionable items immediately so you can improve, not just improve, but make sure that your high availability and disaster recovery solutions actually work. And the beauty of doing these episodes, I get to go back to some of these experiences, projects that I've worked on, client environments that I've become exposed to, and most of them, again, one of the reasons they bring me in is sometimes their high availability solutions or even disaster recovery solutions do not work, and that's the worst place to be in. When you put in a lot of time, a lot of effort, you've invested not just the hardware costs, the software costs, the licensing, everything else to make this, whatever solution that you've implemented, make it work. And then all of a sudden, when the time comes that you actually do need it, it doesn't work. I've worked on so many cases in the past where an always on availability groups did not automatically fail over. Or when it did fail over, it didn't do exactly what it was designed to do. And so a lot of these topics that I cover come from those experiences and the lessons. Of course, what good are disasters, what good are uh, stuff like emergency situations when we don't learn from them. And that's one of the reasons I love doing these is because you get to learn from not just my mistakes but from other people's mistakes. Uh, while it is true that experience is or learned experience is the best teacher, I wouldn't recommend doing that for emergency. uh, could be, data is lost and no longer for people to remember. I want to talk about the three things your SQL Server HADR solutions need to work. A typical misconception here is when somebody is new to technologies like SQL Server high availability, like always on availability groups or failover clustering, or even if they move to the cloud, like for instance, they're using platform as a service like Azure SQL DB, and they're looking at the high availability options, disaster recovery options. They instinctively, and I don't know, maybe it is because of the way technology has been introduced to us. I mean, when you start to think about it, a kid has an iPad or a phone, somebody hands him or her a phone or an iPad, and then they start working on it, not realizing that there are things that you have to consider as you're using that device or that iPhone. For instance, you got to be aware of the fact that you have to plug it in because sooner or later, the moment that you use the device, battery dries out. Now you have to plug it in and be recharged. Of course, a lot of us who are working with devices, laptops, computers, uh, tablets, phones, we know now, right now that we've been using it almost every day. We know now that you have to carry either a battery pack, charger with you all the time. But again, the same thing applies when you're being introduced to new technology. For instance, SQL Server. I was on one of the online communities the other day. They were trying out always on availability groups, and they were doing all of these things. They were following Microsoft documentation, and all of a sudden, whew, works. Now they're ready to deploy it in production. Not so fast, because when you start to look at one approach of learning this, that's just the technical aspect of making the solution work, right? Um, Again, we're only seeing one portion of the implementation of a high availability solution, and that is the technical portion. There's a whole spectrum of this. ranging from the processes wherein you have to be aware of what processes need to be either created, needed to be updated, or possibly modified. If you have an existing process, maybe you need to modify it. And then the people aspect, who needs to be involved, what skill sets do they need, and are they even available, right? So I kind of call that the PPT manifesto, where you're looking at both the people and the process first, and then the technology. Because more often than not, technical professionals like us, we would jump immediately at the chance to get our hands dirty and start working on the technology without realizing, oops, didn't work the way I expected to. Right? Get your pen and paper ready. I'm old school like that. I still have pen and paper. Get your pen and paper ready. Write these things down, because the goal, again, the goal of these weekly episodes is to share actionable items that you can take with you, run with it, and then do some evaluation of your existing high availability and disaster recovery solutions. Or if you're in the development stage, meaning you're still planning, you're still doing your proof of concept, and then planning for deployment a couple of weeks or maybe a couple of months from now, is you get yourself ready so that when real disaster happens, or when an incident happens, that you need to have these solutions working, that they do actually work, right? Not when there's a real emergency and all of a sudden what's supposed to be highly available is down for 16 hours. Kind of defeats the purpose. Again, get your pen and paper ready. Three things that you need for your high availability solutions and disaster recovery solutions to actually work. The first one is called resiliency. And here's what I did. I gathered the definition of these items, right? Textbook definition. Because again, it's easy for us to just simply say, oh, I know that. But we'll go back to the definitions, the basics of what these are, and understand how we can apply them in your existing or even in future high availability disaster recovery solutions. The first one is resilience. Now, uh, you can talk about resilience in every other way. There's the textbook definition of resilience, but resilience in general, as far as the business is concerned, right? The business, not your HADR solution. Because when you start to think about it, what are you trying to accomplish in the first place? Are you just deploying a multi-site cluster, and then you put your SQL Server databases on that multi-site cluster just because? No, you are trying to achieve a business objective. And so resilience in this case applies to business resilience, not just your always on availability groups resilience, not just your backup resilience or anything like that. It is to support the overall business goals. Let me grab a textbook definition of what again, it's easy to Google these. Business resilience is the ability to maintain continuous operation. Like, let me highlight that for a second. The ability to maintain continuous operation, because at the end of the day, the business has to run. The business has to make money. It has to generate revenue and profits. So your high availability and disaster recovery solutions are meant to make sure that the business maintains continuous operation. Okay, to protect the people and assets and preserve brand equity. I don't I don't want to dive into the other non-textbook definition, because sometimes people would say, "Oh, it's brand equity," and true, but I don't really care. As a technical professional, sometimes I don't really care about brand equity. What I do care about is the fact that, hey, the solution that I built or now that I'm maintaining has to work. Okay. Business resilience pertains to the ability to maintain continuous operation. And the first time I've gotten, I became aware of this was back in 2007. And, I was working as a data center engineer back then. And living in Singapore, there really isn't much of, uh, let's say, earthquakes that we've experienced. There are a ton of skyscrapers, high-rise buildings and such. And the first time we've experienced an earthquake, it's a mild earthquake though, and we were on the seventh floor. The building was shaking, and all of a sudden, we were all surprised. Well, not me, because I grew up in a country where earthquakes are a thing. Next Wednesday, there might be an earthquake. Who knows? Very mild, but there might be. The Philippines is situated in the Pacific Ring of Fire, so earthquakes are a thing, but not Singapore. And so everybody froze. And of course, in my case, I was just looking around and see what everybody else is doing, because the last thing you want is to cause panic. We were prevented from taking the elevators, or as we call it in Singapore, lifts. We were told not to take the lifts, take the stairs, but then you go in like batches. You don't go all at the same time. And it's clear that they haven't done anything like this before. I'm not sure if, because it's very rare that they have it, uh, if any of them have had the opportunity to do like earthquake drills or anything similar, right? It took us about hours. We had to leave everything in our desk. Nobody carries anything. Leave your laptops, nothing behind, and then walk down the stairs. Well, it's a good exercise. 7 floors, those flights of stairs. We got down, and because we're in the central business district, like everybody is right there in the center of that whatever. I forgot what it is, but we were in that a business complex where we had like tons of high-rise buildings, and we were there for like 2.5, 3 hours, and then we realized, man, if something did happen, how would we respond? For one, we didn't know how to respond to earthquakes. I mean, we did not have a process in place to deal with earthquakes when they do happen. Number two, well, now we have to leave everything, like literally the only thing I carried with me was my phone and my wallet. My bag was inside the building. My laptop was inside the building. And because the entire team, right? We are a team of uh, escalation engineers, Unix and Windows engineers, and then we have operational people. The entire team is there. Okay, so what happens when the entire team gets wiped out because an earthquake like that happened? And a lot of these questions came up just because of that incident. From their history, they've never had anything like that before, and so it wasn't obvious that we needed to do something like that. 3 months later, we now have a business continuity plan. And everybody was told, nobody comes to the office today. Let's assume we had another earthquake drill like that. You stay wherever you are. A couple of my colleagues were from Malaysia, and they were working from Malaysia, which is like, a couple of hours drive. Everybody was told, stay where you are and pretend that we had to invoke business continuity. And so work wherever you are, do whatever you need to do, and see if we can continue running business as usual. That's it. It's a simple exercise. But if not for that earthquake incident, we would not have had that idea of requiring business continuity. Because when you start to think about this, it's more than just you implementing a high availability solution or disaster recovery solution. I'll give you an example. For instance, always on availability groups, you have 2 nodes for local high availability and another node for disaster recovery. Let's assume that something like an earthquake, I don't know, a tsunami, or any natural disaster happened, fire, whatever, and you don't have a business continuity plan. Sure, the availability group automatically failed over as part of local high availability because the cluster does that. But what about DR? Do you invoke the DR? Of course, depending on how you configure it, typically in long distances, you would configure asynchronous asynchronous secondary for your available group replicas. What am I blanking out? You configure asynchronous secondaries, which means you have to manually fail over to your DR. But again, if your entire team is in that spot where the entire floor went down because of a natural disaster like, uh, again, fire, earthquakes, then who does the failing over? Nobody. And these are lessons that keep coming up over and over and over again. The first time I've heard of situations like this was 9/11. The companies who had data centers in New York City, and only New York City, the companies that only had people in New York City, and only New York City, well, took them months to even recover. And of course, if you're not in operation for months, you'd be out of business. Whereas those companies who had data centers and staff in New Jersey, and New Jersey's what, like 30, depending on traffic, of course, and uh, depending on how many times you had to stop for a traffic light in New York City. New Jersey's what, like just right across the river. Companies who had staff and infrastructure in place, data center in place in New Jersey, were able to pick up quickly compared to those who have only data centers and staff in New York City. And this is part of resiliency. We're looking at building a resilient team, building a resilient infrastructure, and building resilient uh, processes. Because again, you cannot really predict all natural disasters that is going to happen. In fact, a lot of the times, people and companies would push back on high availability and disaster recovery solutions because, well, we have not had it yet, unless of course there's a regulation or a compliance requirement that would had them implement high availability and disaster recovery solution. And the normal response to that is, well, you don't actually need a doctor. You don't need a health insurance right now because you're healthy. And then they realize, well, I don't know. What if I'm not 5 years from now? And that's the whole point of having a high availability and disaster recovery. You don't know when situations like these are going to happen. So it's up to you to prepare for that so that, again, going back to the definition of business resilience, your business, not just your SQL Server databases, but the entire business can continue operation, everything. You can only do so anticipating the need. I mean, go back a couple of months ago when everybody else is still, well, most majority of us are still working from home, and then all of a sudden Facebook rolled out an update, and now they cannot roll back the update because they're all from working from home, and they cannot access the data centers. Nobody anticipated that, and it wasn't really a part of a disaster recovery strategy or anticipation of whatever it is they need to deal with. That was a first time thing. So there's preparing for what you know and kind of anticipating what you don't know, preparing for it while of course not getting so paranoid about, wait, what happens if we hit an earthquake again. Singapore back then, they rarely experience earthquakes, so they don't know, right? Even here in Canada, where we don't experience a lot of earthquakes, when an earthquake happens, most of the time, people don't even know how to respond. Because again, why would you prepare for something that you've never experienced before, right? So that's the first thing, business resilient. And I know I've been spending a lot of time on this because, for one, um, we don't think about the business resilience in general. We're only focused on SQL Server, always on availability groups, failover clustered instances. And then we think, okay, we're good, right? No, you have to prepare for the people aspect of it. You have to prepare for the process aspect of it. The technology is just one piece of it. Okay? That way, when a real disaster happens, your company is, you know, can go back to business as usual. There may be a short blip, maybe an hour, 2 hours, real disasters happen, and then you're back in business. Okay, so that's the first one. And again, I spent a lot of time on this because um, most technical professionals when given the responsibility to build a high availability or disaster recovery solution, and again, I'm not excusing myself from that, we're fixated on the tech aspect of it instead of focusing on other things that could impact the design. This, SQL Server is just one of them, or your availability group is just one of them. Okay. The second one is recovery. And of course, if you've been working with databases or backups, you know for a fact that you need to recover data. But part of your disaster recovery solution needs to have, or high availability solution, it needs to have the ability to recover. Okay. And not just recover data, but also system recovery, and also people recovery, and also process recovery. What do I mean by that? Let's first look at the data recovery. Of course, you rely so much on the backups. Interestingly, when people start looking at always on availability groups, they say, hey, I've got multiple copies of my database. No need for backups, right? No, because just because you have another copy of the database doesn't mean that it becomes your backups. And of course, when you've also started working with uh, and experience something like automatic page restore, woohoo, I've got my secondary replica fixing data corruption for my primary replica databases. You're like, okay, so I don't need backups anymore, right? No, because for one, your secondary copy of the database in an availability group, that extra copy is exactly how your primary copy looks like. So situations, for instance, like somebody dropped a table thinking, or deleted a ton of records thinking that they were in development environment, but they're actually in production, that gets cascaded over to your secondary replica databases. And so what happens is that, well, now you cannot recover because that mistake got propagated over to your secondary. And this is not like, your log backups or log shipping where you have delays. In availability group, immediately after the transaction is persisted on the primary, that gets sent over to the secondary. And so whatever happens on the primary happens on the secondary as well. There might be some delays depending on your compute resources, your network resources, and storage resources, but at the end of the day, they're almost exactly the same. So you need backups still, even if you have something like an always on availability groups, or secondary replica, or even failover clustered instances. Just in case you're not aware, failover clustered instances only has one copy of the database, no extra copy. So that's something you also need to consider. Like, okay, I've got 3 nodes, but I only have one copy of the database. Again, the goal is for you to be able to recover. So that's the first one, being able to recover the data using backups, being able to recover people. What do I mean by that? I used that example earlier of 9/11 happening, and people are not spread out across different uh, states, different countries, for instance. And from my experience in a real disaster situation, nobody in their right mind would be sitting in front of a computer failing over, right? Failing over all of your HA or DR solutions to the disaster recovery site. Anybody who is in the right mind would move away from the disaster as much as they possibly can and protect your family, whatever is important to them. It's just human nature. It's survival instinct. I remember when we were running the always on available group, the senior DBA's ultimate field guide training class. Somebody dropped out from the training class when we were doing it online. Somebody dropped out, and I didn't know why, and she was gone for that day. Next day, she came up and joined the class very early on and started apologizing. And she said, we needed to evacuate. I had to take my kids with me. We hop on our van, took everything that we needed to do to bring with us for emergencies, and then drove north. She's based in Florida, and there was a hurricane, and everybody was told to evacuate. So again, in a real disaster situation, our natural response is to move away from the disaster as much as we possibly can because we want to protect ourselves. So it's not you who should be invoking DR. It should be somebody else. You got to make sure that you have people who have been recovered. What do I mean by recovered? Well, they're not tired, they're not exhausted, they're not in the same area as where the incident is happening. Somebody else has to do it, which also means that it's not supposed to be a one-man team. I keep telling my customers, HA and DR is a team sport. Everybody needs to be involved, and it's not just handful of people. Of course, the higher the SLAs, the higher the or the more stricter or the stricter the RPO and RTO, you got to have a team of people who are capable to do this, right? So data recovery, people recovery, process recovery. What happens if you've rehearsed your disaster recovery plan based on the documentation and all of a sudden, well, didn't work? You need to have a backup of that. A lot of these things we don't pay attention to because, for one, most of the time we haven't even tested our disaster recovery plan. That's the second one, recovery. So the first one is business resilience or resilience. The second one is recovery. The third one is contingency. Contingency. What is contingency? I'll grab this definition from uh, off of Google. Again, textbook definition. Conting- a contingency plan prepares a business for any potential event that could significantly impact day-to-day operations. If you remember, even in the definition of business resilience, we are looking at business operations. We need to be back uh, and maintain day-to-day operations. Anything that would disrupt that, okay, anything that would disrupt business operation is putting a risk on business. And so if you're spinning up an always on availability group or log shipping, or you're designing a backup strategy, keep in mind that the goal is to make sure that you're not just meeting your recovery point, recovery time objectives and SLAs, is to bring the business back to normal day-to-day operations. So a contingency plan is that plan that would help prepare the business for any potential event that could significantly affect day-to-day operations. And like I said in the beginning, there really isn't any way for you to know what else could happen in the future. Like for instance, ransomware is something that only came up in the last couple of years. 2 decades ago, there was no such thing, and people are not even planning for something like that. So backups. Sure, there were normal practices of taking backups to a removable device and then putting that removable device to a safe uh, storage facility, could be a secure storage facility. That's it. But now, with the advent of the cloud, with the advent of newer technologies, newer risks come into place. And so now people are started thinking about ransomware. Was it part of their contingency plans in the past? No, because it never occurred to them until they start reading stories. And now they're getting ready to prepare for that and included it as part of their contingency plan. What about data leaks? A lot of people don't really look at security as part of your disaster recovery strategy. And it never occurred to me until a couple of years ago. I think it was more than a decade ago. I was asked to review or analyze the SQL Server error log, and I started looking at patterns where there were a ton of login failed for SA, and of course, a lot of apps still use SA. I wish they didn't. I really wish they didn't. A lot of apps still use SA, and I started seeing a lot of login failed for user SA event in the SQL Server error log. And I started looking at patterns. Lo and behold, there were tables that were compromised. And because of this, we had to go back and recover the data. Going back to point number 2, we started recovering the data, but only for that specific table. When we found out that the SA login was compromised, we had to put the database in restricted modes so that only I and other people who are part of the security team would be able to start looking at what the problem is. But imagine we had to put the database in restricted access mode just so we can do the analysis, just so we can recover the data that were compromised, just so we can lock it down. But the thing is, we don't look at security as a high availability and a disaster recovery risk, right? Similar to um, ransomware. I never saw security back then as something that would impact high availability and disaster recovery. But this has become a part of the contingency plan. And that's one of the reasons why we're looking at a lot of these things. Security, performance, availability are all a part of making sure that the business can still run, like day-to-day operations. Okay, so that's the third one. So you have resilience, business resilience, you have recovery, and not just data recovery, infrastructure recovery, application recovery, people recovery as well, and process recovery. And finally, you have contingency, things that you anticipate that could happen, plan for those things in case they do happen, and have your people, have your processes be prepared for when those unexpected event happens. And again, the earthquake incident, something that we didn't anticipate until it happened. We did not have a contingency for it. And the good thing is that the business was not really affected. We had staff who are not in Singapore who can take over the workload. They took over the day-to-day operations while we scattered around in the central complex, wondering when we could ever come back to the building, right? It's all of these things where you don't anticipate it, but then when it happens, it can now be a part of your overall contingency plan as part of your HADR solution, right? There you have it. 3 things that you need in order for your HADR solutions to work. And technology, technical features, and whatever SQL Server runs on top of, whether it's a failover cluster, a third-party backup solutions, whatever, this the recovery and the contingency need to be a part of your overall HADR solution in order for them to actually work the way you want them to work, right? That is about it for this week's episode. And again, tune in for another topic of conversation for next week. It's interesting. Again, I get these questions from my clients, projects that I've worked on in the past and ones that I'm currently working on that provide insights as to how you can actually make your SQL Server HADR solutions practical. Take action on it. That is about it for today. And if you have any questions, no, not really questions, if you need help with evaluating your existing high availability and disaster recovery solution, maybe you're missing some gaps, or your staff is not ready to support it because a third party came in, built it, designed it, deployed it. Now all of a sudden your team does not have any clue at all how to manage it. Reach out. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. Let's have that conversation and identify what those gaps are, because the last thing you want is not to be prepared for when a real emergency happens and you built this very expensive HADR solution, but it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, right? Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and let's have that conversation. I'm more than happy to help in any way I can. And if not, I'll steer you in the direction that will best serve your needs. Before we forget, this weekend, if you're in North America, or if you're supporting infrastructures in North America, this weekend is the ST weekend. I say that because, again, this is something that I realized was a thing until I started getting exposed to stuff like this, and it did affect my availability. Imagine having to deal with massive uh, pages and alerts because the time jumped backwards. So now I have to make sure that I either turn off our monitoring system or make sure that I take a nap before DST so that in case something happens, I'm ready if I'm on call. Good thing is I'm not on call anymore. Haha. 10 years later, I'm no longer on call. I'm glad. Anyway, get get your watches ready, get everything ready for DST weekend if you need to tweak some of your monitoring tools to make sure that you're not bombarded with a ton of alerts this coming weekend. Go for it. Better prepare for something like that before you end up becoming unrecoverable by Monday because you're so tired and exhausted dealing with DST related alerts. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. I'll see you again next time.